Hello and welcome to my quick start guide to Blender 2.8 and above. My name is Crompwell. I'll be your host for today, and I'll be teaching you how to download, install, and pre-configure Blender for the purposes of learning 3D modeling. In future videos, I'll show you around the user interface. I'll teach you some techniques for navigating Blender's Viewport, as well as giving you some basic 3D terminology and a simple beginner exercise for starting to learn some of the tools for 3D modeling within Blender. So to begin, let's take a look at the blender.org page, which I've got up here now. If you've got permissions to install software on your computer, feel free to press this big blue download button. You can see we're going to be using Blender version 2.82a. So download the installer, run it, and launch the program like you would any other software you've probably installed on your computer before. For those of us who don't have permissions to install software on our computers, we need to head over to the download page. Once there, we need to look for the Other Versions drop-down menu, and in our case, we'll be using the portable zip archive for Blender, and what's nice about this is it lets us download the archive, extract it onto our computer, and we can run the executable file directly from the folder without needing permissions to install it on our machine. If we'd like to make any configurations that we'll be using later on with Blender, we can also pack that file or folder into a zip drive or flash drive and bring it along with us in case we'd like to work elsewhere. So this is a very handy type of install, quote unquote, that we have available to us on the Blender website. For those of you who are using other operating systems, be sure to check the offerings that Blender makes available to you below. Now, in the interest of time, I've already downloaded the portable zip archive and extracted it onto my desktop. That may take about a minute or so. I think it's about 300 megabytes. And here you can see we've got the folder. It may look a little complicated to begin with, but the thing we're going to focus on is right here, the Blender executable. Now, before I open this, there's one thing that I need to do to make sure that all of my configurations stay inside this folder and don't try to install on my computer or look for pre-configured installs that I may have already made on my computer. So I'm going to go into the 2.82 folder. I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm simply going to call it config. Now, this is a great way to have a test version of Blender in case you're developing add-ons or anything like that, and you'll be able to basically launch Blender fresh as if you've never opened it before, even if you have a previous install on your machine. So let's do that now. And you can see here we are inside of a fresh install of Blender 2.82a for the first time. So congratulations, you've installed the software. Next, we're going to look at some basic quick setup, and I'm going to walk you through the file and edit menus, and then we're going to look at some of the preferences in a very abbreviated manner. So first things first, I like to map my spacebar to the search function, and all the rest of these default settings are going to be a-okay. If you'd like to know any more about these, keep an eye out for future videos that I'll be recording and uploading, and they'll go through some of the settings in a little more depth. And then if you need specific help, feel free to leave your questions and comments in the comments section below or contact me whichever way you know how. And I'll be happy to do what I can in order to help you. All right, so moving right along, we're going to hit next. And you can see here that Blender gives us a number of pre-configured layout files. Now it says new file, but don't make the mistake of thinking that this is going to create different file types or anything like that. These are all going to create a standard Blender file, and they're just pre-configured with different user interface layouts that help us do specific things. So for example, if you'd like to do 2D animation, you can click on the 2D animation new file option here, and it will open up a new file layout for 2D animation that you can begin doing your work in. So it's up to you how you'd like to use this. For our purposes, we're just going to stick with the general layout, and then later we're going to be looking at the modeling tab. On the right side, we have some useful links, so if you'd like to know more about anything that's going on inside of Blender, there's the manual or documentation as it's sometimes called. You can see Blender's website here, their credits, and the release notes for the current version that we're working on. So any new changes or things that have released with this version of Blender, you can find them here. If you're feeling particularly generous, there's also the option to donate to Blender's development fund to keep it funded for future cycles of development release. However, that's not mandatory. It's just for those of you who are feeling generous, because of course, as we know, Blender is indeed free and open source software. So now let's do away with this splash screen since we don't need it anymore. If for any reason you find that you do need it, there is the Blender logo in the upper left-hand corner where we can click the splash screen. And then of course we can click out. So the next thing I'd like to call out to you is the file drop-down menu. Now, this is pretty standard for most creative software. You can see we've got the new file option, which has all of our different layout configurations. We have the open menu. We have a recover option here. There are some limited autosave features inside of Blender. I would suggest don't rely on those when possible. Make sure that you're saving your files diligently. You also have some save options here. This will save your Blender file into a .blend format or .blend. You have the ability to link files and append files. Now, append is nice because if you have a Blender file saved onto your computer somewhere, you can actually take libraries from it and include it in the version or file that you're working in currently. So that's a nice way to kind of take things from other files and reuse them and things like this. Data previews, we're not going to worry about. Import and export, these are just very common file type extensions that you'll see in a lot of 3D applications. So the two most common that you'll most likely see is the wavefront.obj. So .obj, you'll see probably a lot of that if you get into 3D. And then of course the .fbx. Now some new file formats may include the GLTF format, and then Alembic is another one that I've seen pretty regularly. And of course I've seen all of these before at least once or twice, but the most common are the ones that I've already called out. The next thing that we need to look at is actually very important, and I'd like you to make a special note of this and pay extra attention to this, is the external data option here. Now, what this allows us to do is to pack certain dependencies into our Blender file. Now, what that means is if there's a file such as an image or something outside of our Blender file that we're kind of bringing in and introducing into our Blender file, if we want to move the Blender file afterwards, we either need to keep a track of that file that we have linked into the Blender file. So for example, if I have an image of a smiley face or an emoji or something like this, and I want to map it onto the cube in our scene, I have to import that image into Blender. Now Blender is going to look at where that image is saved on my computer's hard drive, and it's going to make a note of it. Now, if I move that image or it otherwise gets lost or deleted, Blender's not going to know where that is, and then I'm going to run into trouble if I try to reopen this file at a later time. So by packing everything into my .blend file, it takes that image and it stores it inside of the blender.blend file so that I always have it with my project. Now, when my students are working on 3D photogrammetry projects, some of them have image textures that come in, or most of them, I should say, have image textures that come in with their .obj mesh that are mapped onto the surface. Those image textures are mapped. And so it looks beautiful, it's nice. And so I always encourage them to make sure that they pack into their .blend to make sure they know where those image files are at all times. Otherwise, if you're good at keeping all of your projects in specific project folders and keeping your images together with your .blend file, and you want to move that around, that's perfectly fine. That would go a long way to keeping your .blend file lightweight, because of course, when you do pack things into your Blender file, it does increase the file size. So just note that under the file menu, under the external data option here, we have the ability to pack files. And that's very, very important if we want to keep track of things and make sure we know where all of our external dependencies are at all times. Make sure you use this if you need to. Now, the next option is cleanup, which is sort of related to the last thing we just looked at. So for example, again, if I put that smiley face image onto the surface of this cube, and then I delete the cube, the smiley face image doesn't just disappear. It's still stored in the memory, and it's taking up space and resources that we could use for other things, and it's making our file sizes larger, etc. So in order to get rid of that, we can come over here and hit the Purge All option, and that gets rid of any orphaned data blocks that are not currently being used by anything in our 3D scene. Now, the nice thing about Blender traditionally is that, and I'm pretty sure it's still the same today, but don't quote me on this. If you want to know more, go look at the documentation. But I do believe that when you close Blender, it will do this by default. However, if you don't want to have to close Blender and you're still in the middle of working, but you know there's some orphan data that you've got left that's taking up space or that's kind of floating around in the memory, feel free to go to the File menu, go to Cleanup, and hit Purge All. The last option here that's not super obvious is the default setting. And what's nice about this is if we make any configurations to Blender or customizations, we can then say save startup file, and Blender will reference this Blender file in order to create it each time that we open up Blender. And so any changes that we make will be opened each time. So say, for example, I wanted to remove the camera and the light out of the scene and then save this file every time I open up Blender. Now it will no longer have the camera and the light. So that's one way to kind of customize the way Blender opens for you. Now, this other option here, load factory settings, is useful for if you end up messing up Blender or something is unexpected happening that you don't really know what's going on, or Perhaps maybe you've broken the user interface in some way and you can't really revert back to a usable state of Blender, or you're not really sure what's going on. You can load your factory settings and Blender will open up to more or less what we're seeing here because we've opened Blender for the first time. And so before doing this, I would highly recommend that you save your file first, because Blender will completely wipe all of its settings back to the factory default. And so save your file first, reset Blender, and then either try to reopen your file and see if that fixes your problem, or use the append option and grab whatever libraries you were working on, perhaps whatever meshes and resources you had previously, and then import those into the new reset version of Blender and see if that solves your problem. And then, of course, at the very bottom, we have a quit application option here, or the red X button in the upper right-hand corner or left-hand corner for those Mac users out there. Those are pretty standard. The next menu we can look at is the edit menu. So we have an undo and redo option. That's pretty standard. Control Z to undo, and then Shift Control Z to redo. So that's a little bit different than some other 3D applications for those of you who have seen 3D applications before. This is more similar to a Photoshop workflow. So Shift Control Z to redo. Just make a note of that. We also have an undo history where we can see kind of the undo steps that we've done, a repeat last option, which is really nice. So Shift R, if we do any certain action inside of Blender, we can hit Shift R and repeat that action. We also have a history for that, so we can see our repeat options. And then we have a adjust last operation option as well. So any action that has parameters that we performed previously, we can hit the F9 button and it will give us the option to tweak those parameters after the fact, which is pretty nice. We have a search operator, or an operator search, I should say, and that's mapped to the F3 key by default. However, we've also gone ahead and mapped it to the spacebar because that's how I like to work. We have some rename options, which is pretty standard for Windows. Even if you do this in the Windows Explorer, if you hit the F2 key with something selected, it will allow you to rename it, generally speaking. Same thing in Blender, and then if you want to batch rename, select multiple things and hit Control F2. We're going to keep our object modes locked like we have here, and that's simply so that way when we select things, we're going to stay in a consistent object mode so that way we can predict what's going to happen. So don't worry about that, just leave it default. And now we're going to get into some interesting settings here in the preferences menu. Now, just as a warning, I'm not going to go through every single preference or setting, category in the preferences menu. Because there's simply too many of them and not all of them are relevant to what we're trying to accomplish. So I'm going to call out the ones that are important for us. And if you'd like to know anything else about some specific settings in here, feel free to hover over the option and it will give you a tooltip. And then if you need more in-depth information, feel free to reference Blender's manual or, of course, try to reach out to someone in the community. Again, I will reference you to the comment section down below. I'll be happy to help in any way that I can. All right, so to begin, under the Blender preferences, we have the interface category here, where we're going to be looking at our resolution scale. Now, if I scroll this, you can see that Blender kind of scales its user interface, and I'm going to put mine at 1.25. And this is just for the purpose of making things a little more visible for those of you who are watching along or perhaps using a mobile device. It'll make things just a little bit easier to see. Now, when I work, I prefer to have it at 1.0 simply because it gives me more screen real estate to work with. But for the sake of those of you who are watching along with me, I do this for you. And then if anyone's got problems with that or needs help with it, feel free to let me know and I will make the necessary adjustments in whatever future content that I have for you. All right, so moving along, we're not going to necessarily be changing this for the purpose of this video, but for those of you who don't speak English as a first language, please know that Blender does have the option to translate its user interface into a number of other languages. Just bear in mind that this left column shows you the number of complete translations that are done for the interface. This middle column shows you the number of in-progress translations, so these are not completed, but may be more than likely usable. And then these last two columns show you the user interface translations that they are currently starting to work on. So these might be largely incomplete and may not work necessarily as you expect it to. Just keep that in mind. If you need any translation, there are some options there for you. Moving right along, we're not going to be making any changes to the themes. I have Blender currently set to the dark theme. If you prefer the light theme, feel free to use that. You can basically customize all of the buttons and look of Blender's interface here. This gets kind of complicated and we could break things, so it's not really in the scope of what we're trying to accomplish, so I'm just going to skip over this. Viewport. We're not going to change anything here, but I'm going to make two important notices that if you're running into any lagging or trouble with processing inside of Blender's viewport, which is this big window here, if you notice that when you're moving around it, it seems kind of choppy or it's lagging, know that you can come to the viewport anti-aliasing option and either drop your samples down or simply put on no anti-aliasing. And then the second thing I'll mention about here is that you have two options here that you can turn off for smooth wires in the viewport, which they make things look nicer, which is a little bit easier on the eyes. However, they do require at least a small amount of extra processing power. And so if you're running into the issue of having chugging in your viewport or you're not getting as much responsiveness in the viewport, feel free to change these three settings here, and hopefully that will resolve your issue. In my case, I know that my computer is capable of working with these on, and so we're not going to mess with those. The next thing is custom light settings. We're not going to deal with those. Neither are we going to be looking at editing or animation for the purpose of this course, so we're just going to ignore those. Add-ons. Now, add-ons are really important. Add-ons are a huge part of Blender's ecosystem, so to speak. They are basically plugins that allow us to do some really useful functions and different things that may not be so easy to do right out of the gate with Blender in the default settings. There are a number of them that ship with Blender by default, as you can see here, and I do use a lot of these in my workflow when I work professionally in Blender. One thing I will say is there's a huge community built around these add-ons. There are many people who are creating them and maintaining them, some people giving them away for free, some people selling them. The majority of them that you'll find that are paid are somewhere between $1 and I would say maybe $15, $20. Some of the higher end ones, which you see a little bit less, are going to be around the $30 to $50 range. And then very rarely you'll see some that break the $100 range, which are usually for very specific things that are task repetitive and have some really hefty coding behind it. So just know that there are a whole lot of add-ons that can make your life a lot easier if you care to dig into them. For the purpose of this quick start guide, I'm simply going to keep us at the kind of vanilla base Blender settings. If for any reason I do need to turn one of these on, it will be one that ships with Blender, and I will make sure that I show you that I'm turning it on, explaining what it does, and kind of demonstrating that for you so you don't have to worry about needing to hunt anything down online or figure things out like that. I will make sure that you understand what I'm doing. Now, for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on one that I've pre-installed, and you don't need to turn this on. This is not necessarily going to change anything for you. This is for the purpose of showing you exactly what keys I'm pressing, just to make things easier to see on screen. So that way you can follow along with the buttons I'm pressing on the keyboard, the way I'm using my mouse, etc. So moving beyond that, one quick thing. I need to save my preferences. Now I know it has autosave preferences on, but I don't really trust computers to do all of the work for me. So sometimes I like to come in here and press the save button for myself to make sure that I've done that. All right, so moving on is the input section. Now we're not going to change anything in here, but I'm going to call out two very useful settings in here for those of you who may have a different setup than me. So for those of you who might be working on a laptop or don't have an extended number pad on your keyboard, if you'd like to emulate the functionality of that extended number pad, there is an option here for you. And now what this does is when you turn this on, it will take the functionality that would have been assigned to the number pad and it assigns it to the 1 through 0 keys above the keyboard, above the letters. So most people will have, I would hope anyways, numbers on their keyboard. They might not have the extended keypad. And so we can remap that functionality. Now just know that if you do this, it's going to change some of the functionality when we get into actual 3D modeling in terms of being able to select our quote unquote sub-object components. I will call this out when we get to it. So don't worry if you don't understand what that means, but just know that this is going to change some functionality if you want to emulate the number pad. Now previously, this used to be a really important feature to have. Currently, with Blender 2.8 and above, they've added in some really nice user interface features that kind of get rid of the need for this if we don't want to use it. Now, I know most people that use Blender professionally or use 3D professionally that have this sort of functionality. Well, this is specific to Blender primarily, but those of us who use it professionally tend to want to have an extended number pad on the keyboard. And so they'll opt for this, but it's not entirely necessary now, thankfully. And again, I will show you that when we get there. The other option, of course, is the ability to emulate a 3-button mouse. So for those of you who are using a laptop with a trackpad, I'm sorry, that's probably going to be rather frustrating because it's difficult to control Blender in that way. So I would highly recommend getting at least a 2-button mouse, if not a 3-button mouse. I'm working with a 3-button mouse because the middle mouse button and the scroll wheel does have a lot of functionality that's actually kind of important to have inside of Blender. But again, it's not entirely necessary because there are some new user interface features that are built into Blender that make it a little bit easier to get away with not using a 3-button mouse. So for those of you who want to emulate it, just know that if you turn this on, as you can see with the tooltip there, you can emulate a middle mouse button click with the Alt left mouse button combination. And so that makes things a little more complicated, but if you want to have it, it's there for you. Otherwise, we can use the user interface to kind of get around it, but I would highly recommend that you have at least a 2-button mouse while working with Blender. So now that that's out of the way, let's continue on. We have some navigation options. We're not going to play with any of those settings, just leave them default. And then in the Keymap section, I'm going to turn on my select toggles or select all toggles. And essentially what this does is when I press the A key inside of Blender, it selects everything inside of my 3D scene. And then with this selected on, when I press A again, it will deselect anything that's selected. So I simply have to toggle through the A key to get a full selection and a no selection. Now, if I leave this off in order to deselect everything or no select everything, I will either have to double tap A or press Alt and A at the same time. And you can see that under the select menu here. If I move this out of the way and I open this up, you can see the none selection or select nothing is Alt A. And so I don't want to have to go and press that button every time, and I don't want to have to keep double tapping A or Alt A. I just want to hit A once and just have it do what I expect it to do. And so I like to have that setting on. You'll also notice here that if you want to change any of the settings that we pre-configured in the quick setup at the beginning on the splash screen, you have the option to change them here. So the select with option being left, you can change that if you so choose. And the spacebar action being mapped to the search function can also be changed here if you want. Now in the Keymap menu, if you'd like to change any of the hotkeys within Blender, you can do that here. And sometimes it's necessary to do that when you've installed a certain add-on that will change the key mappings with it. But in this case, I would say that if you're not familiar with this, if you're a brand new beginner to Blender and you're not familiar with what the key mappings are, you can learn some of the key mappings here, but I would highly try to dissuade you from attempting to change them because it's easy to break some of Blender's functionality by kind of messing up with the hotkeys. So if you'd like to follow along with me, just leave these by default. We're just going to turn on these select all toggles. The last thing that I'll do for my situation is I need to turn on CUDA for my cycle renders devices under the system tab. And the reason for this is because I have 2 CUDA enabled graphics processing units, GPUs, or otherwise known as graphics cards in my computer that will help me to render images faster if I'm using the Cycles render engine. For those of you who are using the Intel Optics engine inside of Blender or have an RTX enabled card, which you'll need for this, feel free to enable those GPUs here. And then for those of you who are using AMD's OpenCL enabled cards, feel free to enable them there. Now, if you don't have any 3 of these, don't fret, it's okay. Simply click none and leave it on none, and this will allow Blender to use your CPU or your processor to create the image that we're going to be looking at inside of Cycles when we get around to that point. And it might just take slightly longer than if you had a GPU. But for my case, I'm going to be working with CUDA. And the other option that I'm going to call out simply for optimization's sake, in case you're running into any problems, is when you go to undo things, if Blender kind of lags and holds for a bit, maybe it hangs for a bit while you're trying to undo something because perhaps you've got a large scene or something like this. I've run into this with a very large unoptimized scene that I've worked on in the past. But if you run into this, feel free to either turn down the undo steps, and this will change the number of undo options that we have. So obviously, if you turn it down, you'll use up less memory, but you'll also have less undos before you kind of run out. And this can be useful for making sure that you don't run into as many hangs. And then you can also tell Blender explicitly how many megabytes of memory you want it to take up with its undo option here. Other than that, we're just going to leave everything by default and hit our save preferences section option there. And we're going to close this window, and we've pre-configured Blender. We're going to be looking at this modeling tab in the next video. So I hope this was helpful for you. If you've got any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section down below. If you found this video useful, I would really appreciate it if you'd like and subscribe, turn on notifications, and share the video with anyone else that you might think would benefit from it or otherwise learn from it. And then apart from that, I want to wish you all a very happy day. I hope you're doing okay out there. Please stay safe, and thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.